our own, but they acted on the defensive and were not equally exposed to disorganization. Cohesion was lost, says one of McDowell's staff, and the men walked quietly off. There was no special excitement except that arising from the frantic efforts of officers to stop men who paid little or no attention to anything that was said. And there was no panic, in the ordinary sense and meaning of the word, until the retiring soldiers, guns, wagons, congressmen and carriages were fired upon, on the road east of Bull Run. At Centreville the reserve division stood fast, and the fact that these troops were proof against the infection of panic and the exaggerated stories of the fugitives is in itself strong testimony to the native courage of the soldiery. A lack of competent staff officers, which, earlier in the day, had prevented an advance on Centreville by the Confederate right, brought Johnston's arrangements for pursuit to naught. The cavalry, weak in numbers, was soon encumbered with squads of prisoners. Darkness fell upon the field, and the defeated army streamed over the roads to Washington, followed only by its own fears. Why the Confederate generals did not follow up their success on the following day is a question round which controversy raged for many a year. Deficiencies in commissariat and transport, the disorganization of the army after the victory, the difficulties of a direct attack upon Washington, defended as it was by a river a mile broad, with but a single bridge, and patrolled by gunboats. The determination of the government to limit its military operations to a passive defence of Confederate territory have all been pressed into service as excuses. "Give me 10,000 fresh troops," said Jackson as the surgeon dressed his wound, "and I would be in Washington tomorrow." Before 24 hours had passed, reinforcements had increased the strength of Johnston's army to 40,000. Want of organisation had undoubtedly prevented McDowell from winning a victory on the 19th or 20th, but pursuit is a far less difficult business than attack. There was nothing to interfere with a forward movement. There were supplies along the railway, and if the mechanism for their distribution and the means for their carriage were wanting, the counties adjoining the Potomac were rich and fertile. Herds of bullocks were grazing in the pastures, and the barns of the farmers were loaded with grain. It was not a long supply train that was lacking, nor an experienced staff, nor even well-disciplined battalions, but a general who grasped the full meaning of victory, who understood how a defeated army, more especially of new troops, yields at a touch, and who, above all, saw the necessity of giving the North no leisure to develop her immense resources. For 3 days Jackson impatiently awaited the order to advance, and his men were held ready with 3 days' cooked rations in their haversacks. But his superiors gave no sign, and he was reluctantly compelled to abandon all hope of reaping the fruits of victory. It is true that the Confederates were no more fit for offensive operations than McDowell's troops. "Our army," says General Johnston, "was more disorganized by victory than that of the United States by defeat." But it is to be remembered that if the Southerners had moved into Maryland, crossing the Potomac by some of the numerous fords near Harper's Ferry, they would have found no organized opposition, save the debris of McDowell's army, between them and the northern capital. On July 26th, 5 days after the battle, the general who was to succeed McDowell arrived in Washington and rode round the city. "I found," he wrote, "no preparations whatever for defence, not even to the extent of putting the troops in military position. Not a regiment was properly encamped, not a single avenue of approach guarded. All was chaos, and the streets, hotels, and bar-rooms were filled with drunken officers and men, absent from their regiments without leave, a perfect pandemonium. Many had even gone to their homes, their flight from Bull Run terminating in New York, or even in New Hampshire and Maine. There was really nothing to prevent a small cavalry force from riding into the city. A determined attack would doubtless have carried Arlington Heights and placed the city at the mercy of a battery of rifled guns. If the secessionists attached any value to the possession of Washington, they committed their greatest error in not following up the victory of Bull Run. On the same date, the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, wrote as follows: "The capture of Washington seems now to be inevitable. During the whole of Monday and Tuesday, July 22nd and 23, it might have been taken without resistance. The rout, overthrow and demoralization of the whole army were complete. Of his own share in the battle, either at the time or afterwards, Jackson said but little. A day or two after the battle, an anxious crowd was gathered round the post office at Lexington, awaiting intelligence from the front. A letter was handed to the Reverend Dr. White, who, recognizing the handwriting, exclaimed to the eager groups about him, "Now we shall know all the facts." On opening it he found the following, and no more. "My dear Pastor, in my tent last night, after a fatiguing day's service, I remembered that I had failed to send you my contribution to our coloured Sunday school. Enclosed you will find my cheque for that object, which please acknowledge at your earliest convenience, and oblige yours faithfully, T.J. Jackson." To his wife, however, he was less reserved. "Yesterday," he wrote, "we fought a great battle and gained a great victory, for which all the glory is due to God alone. Whilst great credit is due to other parts of our gallant army, God made my brigade more instrumental than any other in repulsing the main attack. This is for your information only. Say nothing about it. Let others speak praise, not myself." Again on August 5th. "And so you think the papers ought to say more about your husband. My brigade is not a brigade of newspaper correspondence. I know that the 1st Brigade was the first to meet and pass our retreating forces, to push on with no other aid than the smiles of God, to boldly take up its position with the artillery that was under my command, to arrest the victorious foe in his onward progress, to hold him in check until the reinforcements arrived, and finally to charge bayonets and, thus advancing, to pierce the enemy's centre. I am well satisfied with what it did, and so are my generals, Johnston and Beauregard. It is not to be expected that I should receive the credit that Generals Johnston and Beauregard would, because I was under them. But I am thankful to my ever-kind Heavenly Father that he makes me content to await his own good time and pleasure for commendation, knowing that all things work together for my good. If my brigade can always play so important and useful a part as it did in the last battle, I trust I shall ever be most grateful. As you think the papers do not notice me enough, I send a specimen, which you will see from the upper part of the paper is a leader. My darling, never distrust our God, who doeth all things well. In due time he will make manifest all his pleasure, which is all his people should desire. You must not be concerned at seeing other parts of the army lauded, and my brigade not mentioned. Truth is mighty and will prevail. When the official reports are published, if not before, I expect to see justice done to this noble body of patriots. These letters reveal a generous pride in the valour of his troops, and a very human love of approbation struggles with the curb which his religious principles had placed on his ambition. Like Nelson, he felt perhaps that before long he would have a gazette of his own, but still, of his own achievements, of his skilful tactics, of his personal behaviour, of his well-timed orders, he spoke no word, and the victory was ascribed to a higher power. "The charge of the 2nd and 4th Virginia," he wrote in his modest report, "through the blessing of God, who gave us the victory, pierced the centre of the enemy." And Jackson's attitude was that of the Southern people. When the news of Bull Run reached Richmond, and through the crowds that thronged the streets passed the tidings of the victory, there was neither wild excitement nor uproarious joy. No bonfires lit the darkness of the night, no cannon thundered out salutes. The steeples were silent till the morrow, and then were heard only the solemn tones that called the people to prayer. It was resolved on the day following the battle by the Confederate Congress that we recognize the hand of the Most High God, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, in the glorious victory with which he has crowned our arms at Manassas, and that the people of these Confederate states are invited, by appropriate services on the ensuing Sabbath, to offer up their united thanksgivings and prayers for this mighty deliverance. The spoils of Bull Run were large: 1,500 prisoners, 25 guns, 10 stand of colours, several thousand rifles, a large quantity of ammunition and hospital stores, 26 wagons, and several ambulances were left in the victors' hands. The Federal losses were 460 killed and 1,124 wounded. The Confederate, 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing. The 1st Brigade suffered more severely than any other in the Southern Army. Of 3,000 officers and men, 488 were killed or wounded, nearly a fourth of the total loss. A few days after the battle, Johnston advanced to Centreville, and from the heights above the broad Potomac his cavalry vedettes looked upon the spires of Washington. But it was in vain that the Confederate troopers rode to and fro on the riverbank and watered their horses within sight of the capital. The enemy was not to be beguiled across the protecting stream, but it was not from fear. Although the disaster had been as crushing as unexpected, it was bravely met. The President's demand for another army was cheerfully complied with. Volunteers poured in from every state. The men were no longer asked to serve for 3 months, but for 3 years. Washington became transformed into an enormous camp. Great earthworks rose on the surrounding heights, and the training of the new levies went steadily forward. There was no cry for immediate action. Men were not wanting who believed that the task of coercion was impossible. Able statesmen and influential journalists advised the President to abandon the attempt. But Lincoln, true to the trust which had been committed to his keeping, never flinched from his resolve that the Union should be restored. He, too, stood like a wall between his defeated legions and the victorious foe. Nor was the nation less determined. The dregs of humiliation had been drained, and though the draught was bitter, it was salutary. The President was sustained with no half-hearted loyalty. His political opponents raved and threatened, but under the storm of recrimination, the work of reorganizing the army went steadily forward, and the people were content that until the generals declared the army fit for action, the hour of vengeance should be postponed. To the south, Bull Run was a Pyrrhic victory. It relieved Virginia of the pressure of the invasion. It proved to the world that the attitude of the Confederacy was something more than the reckless revolt of a small section. But it led the government to indulge vain hopes of foreign intervention, and it increased the universal contempt for the military qualities of the Northern soldiers. The hasty judgment of the people construed a single victory as proof of their superior capacity for war, and the defeat of McDowell's army was attributed to the cowardice of his volunteers. The opinion was absolutely erroneous. Some of the Federal regiments had misbehaved, it is true. Seized with sudden panic, to which all raw troops are peculiarly susceptible, they had dispersed before the strong counterstroke of the Confederates. But the majority had displayed a sterling courage. There can be little question that the spirit of the infantry depends greatly on the staunchness of the artillery. A single battery, pushed boldly forward into the front of battle, has often restored the vigour of a wavering line. Although the losses it inflicts may not be large, the moral effect of its support is undeniable. So long as the guns hold fast, victory seems possible. But when these useful auxiliaries are driven back or captured, a general depression becomes inevitable. The retreat of the artillery strikes a chill into the fighting line which is ominous of defeat, and it is a wise regulation that compels the batteries, even when their ammunition is exhausted, to stand their ground. The Federal infantry at Bull Run had seen their artillery overwhelmed, the teams destroyed, the gunners shot down, and the enemy's riflemen swarming amongst the abandoned pieces. But so vigorous had been their efforts to restore the battle that the front of the defence had been with difficulty maintained. The guns, though they were eventually lost, had been retaken, and without the assistance of their artillery, but exposed to the fire, at closest range, of more than one battery, the Northern regiments had boldly pushed forward across the Henry Hill. The Confederates, during the greater part of the battle, were certainly outnumbered, but at the close they were the stronger, and the piecemeal attacks of the Federals neutralized the superiority which the invading army originally possessed. McDowell appears to have employed 18,000 troops in the attack, Johnston and Beauregard about the same number. A comparison of the relative strength of the two armies, considering that raw troops have a decided advantage on the defensive, detracts to a certain degree from the credit of the victory, and it will hardly be questioned that had the tactics of the Federals been better, the victory would have been theirs. The turning movement by Sudley Springs was a skillful manoeuvre and completely surprised both Johnston and Beauregard. It was undoubtedly risky, but it was far less dangerous than a direct attack on the strong position along Bull Run. The retention of the 4th Division between Washington and Centreville would seem to have been a blunder. Another 5,000 men on the field of battle should certainly have turned the scale, but more men were hardly wanted. The Federals during the first period of the fight were strong enough to have seized the Henry Hill. Bee, Bartow, Evans and Hampton had been driven in, and Jackson alone stood fast. A strong and sustained attack, supported by the fire of the regular batteries, must have succeeded. The Federal regiments, however, were practically incapable of movement under fire. The least change of position broke them into fragments. There was much wild firing. It was impossible to manoeuvre, and the courage of individuals proved a sorry substitute for order and cohesion. The Confederates owed their victory simply and solely to the fact that their enemies had not yet learned to use their strength. The summer months went by without further fighting on the Potomac, but the camps at Fairfax and at Centreville saw the army of Manassas thinned by furloughs and by sickness. The Southern youth had come out for battle, and the monotonous routine of the outpost line and the parade ground was little to their taste. The government dared not refuse the numberless applications for leave of absence, the more so that in the crowded camps the sultry heat of the Virginia woodlands bred disease of a virulent type. The 1st Brigade seems to have escaped from all these evils. Its commander found his health improved by his life in the open air. His wound had been painful. A finger was broken, but the hand was saved, and some temporary inconvenience alone resulted. As he claimed no furlough for himself, so he permitted no absence from duty among his troops. "I can't be absent," he wrote to his wife, "as my attention is necessary in preparing my troops for hard fighting, should it be required. And as my officers and soldiers are not permitted to visit their wives and families, I ought not to see mine. It might make the troops feel that they are badly treated, and that I consult my own comfort, regardless of theirs." In September, his wife joined him for a few days at Centreville, and later came Dr. White, at his invitation, to preach to his command. Beyond a few fruitless marches to support the cavalry on the outposts, of active service there was none. But Jackson was not the man to let the time pass uselessly. He had his whole brigade under his hand, a force which wanted but one quality to make it an instrument worthy of the hand that wielded it, and that quality was discipline. Courage and enthusiasm it possessed in abundance, and when both were untrained, the Confederate was a more useful soldier than the Northerner. In the South, nearly every man was a hunter, accustomed from boyhood to the use of firearms. Game was abundant, and it was free to all. Sport, in one form or another, was the chief recreation of the people, and their pastoral pursuits left them much leisure for its indulgence. Every great plantation had its pack of hounds, and fox hunting, an heirloom from the English colonists, still flourished. His stud was the pride of every Southern gentleman, and the love of horseflesh was inherent in the whole population. No man walked when he could ride, and hundreds of fine horsemen mounted on steeds of famous lineage recruited the Confederate squadrons. But, despite their skill with the rifle, their hunter's craft, and their dashing horsemanship, the first great battle had been hardly won. The city-bred Northerners, unused to arms and uninured to hardship, had fought with extraordinary determination, and the same want of discipline that had driven them en route to Washington had dissolved the victorious Confederates into a tumultuous mob. If Jackson knew the worth of his volunteers, he was no stranger to their shortcomings. His thoughts might be crystallized in the words of Wellington, words which should never be forgotten by those nations which depend for their defence on the services of their citizen soldiery. "They want," said the great Duke, speaking of the Portuguese in 1809, "the habits and the spirit of soldiers, the habits of command on one side and of obedience on the other, mutual confidence between officers and men." In order that during the respite now offered he might instil these habits into his brigade, Jackson neither took furlough himself nor granted it to others. His regiments were constantly exercised on the parade ground. Shoulder to shoulder they advanced and retired, marched and countermarched, massed in column, formed line to front or flank, until they learned to move as a machine, until the limbs obeyed before the order had passed from ear to brain, until obedience became an instinct and cohesion a necessity of their nature. They learned to listen for the word of the officer, to look to him before they moved hand or foot, and, in that subjection of their own individuality to the will of their superior, they acquired that steadiness in battle, that energy on the march, that discipline in quarters which made the 1st Brigade worthy of the name it had already won. "Every officer and soldier," said their commander, "who is able to do duty ought to be busily engaged in military preparation by hard drilling, in order that, through the blessing of God, we may be victorious in the battles which in his all-wise providence may await us." Jackson's tactical ideas as regards the fire of infantry, expressed at this time, are worth recording. "I rather think," he said, "that fire by file, independent firing, is best on the whole, for it gives the enemy an idea that the fire is heavier than if it was by company or battalion, volley firing. Sometimes, however, one may be best, sometimes the other, according to circumstances. But my opinion is that there ought not to be much firing at all. My idea is that the best mode of fighting is to reserve your fire till the enemy get, or you get them, to close quarters. Then deliver one deadly, deliberate fire, and charge." Although the newspapers did scant justice to the part played by the brigade in the Battle of Bull Run, B's epithet survived, and Jackson became known as Stonewall throughout the army. To one of his acquaintances, the general revealed the source of his composure under fire. 3 days after the battle, hearing that Jackson was suffering from his wound, I rode, writes Imboden, to his quarters near Centreville. Of course, the battle was the only topic discussed during breakfast. "General," I remarked, "how is it that you can keep so cool and appear so utterly insensible to danger in such a storm of shell and bullets as rained about you when your hand was hit?" He instantly became grave and reverential in his manner, and answered in a low tone of great earnestness, "Captain, my religious belief teaches me to feel as safe in battle as in bed. God has fixed the time for my death. I do not concern myself about that, but to be always ready, no matter when it may overtake me." He added after a pause, looking me full in the face, "That is the way all men should live, and then all would be equally brave." Although the war upon the borders had not yet touched the cities of the South, the patriotism of Virginia saw with uneasiness the inroads of the enemy in that portion of the state which lies beyond the Alleghanies, especially the northwest. The country was overrun with federal soldiers, and part of the population of the district had declared openly for the Union. In that district was Jackson's birthplace, the home of his childhood and his mother's grave. His interest and his affections were bound by many ties to the country and the people, and in the autumn of 1861 he had not yet come to believe that they were at heart disloyal to their native state. A vigorous effort, he believed, might still restore to the Confederacy a splendid recruiting ground, and he made no secret of his desire for employment in that region. The strategical advantages of this corner of Virginia were clearly apparent, as will be seen hereafter, to his perception. Along its western border runs the Ohio, a river navigable to its junction with the Mississippi, and giving an easy line of communication into the heart of Kentucky. Through its northern counties passed the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the main line of communication between Washington and the west, and alongside the railway ran the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, a second and most important line of supply. Above all, projecting as it did towards the Great Lakes of the north, the northwestern angle, or Virginia Panhandle, narrowed the passage between east and west to an isthmus not more than 100 miles in breadth. With this territory in the possession of the Confederates, the federal dominions would be practically cut in two, and in northwestern Virginia, traversed by many ranges of well-nigh pathless mountains, with few towns and still fewer roads, a small army might defy a large one with impunity. On November 4, Jackson's wish was partially granted. He was assigned to the command of the Shenandoah Valley District, embracing the northern part of the area between the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge. The order was received with gratitude, but dashed by the fact that he had to depart alone. "Had this communication," he said to Dr. White, "not come as an order, I should instantly have declined it and continued in command of my brave old brigade." Whether he or his soldiers felt the parting most it is hard to say. Certain it is that the men had a warm regard for their leader. There was no more about him at Centreville to attract the popular fancy than there had been at Harper's Ferry. When the troops passed in review, the eye of the spectator turned at once to the trim carriage of Johnston and of Beauregard, to the glittering uniform of Stuart, to the superb chargers and the martial bearing of young officers fresh from the Indian frontier. The silent professor, absent and unsmiling, who dressed as plainly as he lived, had little in common with those dashing soldiers. The tent where every night the general and his staff gathered together for their evening devotions, where the conversation ran not on the merits of horse and hound, on strategy and tactics, but on the power of faith and the mysteries of the redemption, seemed out of place in an army of high-spirited youths. But while they smiled at his peculiarities, the Confederate soldiers remembered the fierce counterstroke on the heights above Bull Run. If the Presbyterian general was earnest in prayer, they knew that he was prompt in battle and indefatigable in quarters. He had the respect of all men, and from his own brigade he had something more. Very early in their service, away by the rippling Shenandoah, they had heard the stories of his daring in Mexico. They had experienced his skill and coolness at Falling Waters. They had seen at Bull Run, while the shells burst in never-ending succession among the pines, the quiet figure riding slowly to and fro on the crest above them. They had heard the stern command, "Wait till they come within 50 yards and then give them the bayonet," and they had followed him far in that victorious rush into the receding ranks of their astonished foe. Little wonder that these enthusiastic youths, new to the soldier's trade, should have been captivated by a nature so strong and fearless. The Stonewall Brigade had made Jackson a hero, and he had won more from them than their admiration. His incessant watchfulness for their comfort and well-being, the patient care with which he instructed them, his courtesy to the youngest private, the tact and thoughtfulness he showed in all his relations with them, had won their affection. His very peculiarities endeared him to them. Old Jack or Stonewall were his nicknames in the lines of his own command, and stories went round the campfire of how he had been seen walking in the woods round Centreville absorbed in prayer, or lifting his left hand with that peculiar gesture which the men believed was an appeal to heaven, but which, in reality, was made to relieve the pain of his wounded finger. But while they discussed his oddities, not a man in the brigade but acknowledged his ability, and when the time came, not a man but regretted his departure. His farewell to his troops was a striking scene. The forest, already donning its gorgeous autumnal robes, shut in the grassy clearing where the troops were drawn up. There stood the grey columns of the 5 regiments, with the colours already tattered, waving in the mild November air. The general rode up, their own general, and not a sound was heard. Motionless and silent they stood, a veritable stone wall, whilst his eye ran along the ranks and scanned the familiar faces. "I am not here to make a speech," he said, "but simply to say farewell. I first met you at Harper's Ferry, at the commencement of the war, and I cannot take leave of you without giving expression to my admiration of your conduct from that day to this, whether on the march, in the bivouac, or on the bloody plains of Manassas, where you gained the well-deserved reputation of having decided the fate of battle. Throughout the broad extent of country through which you have marched, by your respect for the rights and property of citizens, you have shown that you are soldiers not only to defend, but able and willing both to defend and protect. You have already won a brilliant reputation throughout the army of the whole Confederacy, and I trust in the future, by your deeds in the field, and by the assistance of the same kind Providence who has hitherto favoured our cause, You will win more victories and add lustre to the reputation you now enjoy. You have already gained a proud position in the future history of this our second war of independence. I shall look with great anxiety to your future movements, and I trust whenever I shall hear of the 1st Brigade on the field of battle, it will be of still nobler deeds achieved and higher reputation won." Then there was a pause. General and soldiers looked upon each other, and the heart of the leader went out to those who had followed him with such devotion. He had spoken his words of formal praise, but both he and they knew the bonds between them were too strong to be thus coldly severed. For once he gave way to impulse. His eye kindled, and rising in his stirrups and throwing the reins upon his horse's neck, he spoke in tones which betrayed the proud memories that thronged upon him. "In the Army of the Shenandoah you were the 1st Brigade. In the Army of the Potomac you were the 1st Brigade. In the 2nd Corps of the Army you are the 1st Brigade. You are the 1st Brigade in the affections of your general, and I hope by your future deeds and bearing you will be handed down to posterity as the 1st Brigade in this our second war of independence. Farewell." For a moment there was silence. Then the pent-up feeling found expression, and cheer upon cheer burst forth from the ranks of the Valley regiments. Waving his hand in token of farewell, Jackson galloped from the field. Chapter 7. Romney. While the Indian summer still held carnival in the forests of Virginia, Jackson found himself once more on the Shenandoah. Some regiments of militia, the greater part of which were armed with flintlock muskets, and a few squadrons of irregular cavalry formed his sole command. The autumn of 1861 was a comparatively quiet season. The North, silent but determined, was preparing to put forth her stupendous strength. Scott had resigned, McDowell had been superseded, but the President had found a general who had caught the confidence of the nation. In the same month that had witnessed McDowell's defeat, a young officer had gained a cheap victory over a small Confederate force in West Virginia, and his grandiloquent dispatches had magnified the achievement in the eyes of the Northern people. He was at once nicknamed the Young Napoleon, and his accession to the chief command of the Federal armies was enthusiastically approved. General McClellan had been educated at West Point and had graduated first of the class, in which Jackson was 17th. He had been appointed to the Engineers, had served on the staff in the war with Mexico, and as United States Commissioner with the Allied armies in the Crimea. In 1857 he resigned to become president of a railway company, and when the war broke out he was commissioned by the state of Ohio as Major General of Volunteers. His reputation at the military academy and in the regular army had been high. His ability and industry were unquestioned. His physique was powerful, and he was a fine horseman. His influence over his troops was remarkable, and he was emphatically a gentleman. It was most fortunate for the Union at this juncture that caution and method were his distinguishing characteristics. The states had placed at Lincoln's disposal sufficient troops to form an army 7 times greater than that which had been defeated at Bull Run. McClellan, however, had no thought of committing the new levies to an enterprise for which they were unfitted. He had determined that the army should make no move till it could do so with the certainty of success, and the winter months were to be devoted to training and organization. Nor was there any cry for immediate action. The experiment of a civilian army had proved a terrible failure. The nation that had been so confident of capturing Richmond was now anxious for the security of Washington. The war had been in progress for nearly 6 months, and yet the troops were manifestly unfit for offensive operations. Even the crude strategists of the press had become alive to the importance of drill and discipline. October 21st. A reconnaissance in force, pushed, contrary to McClellan's orders, across the Potomac, was repulsed by General Evans at Ball's Bluff with heavy loss, and mismanagement and misconduct were so evident that the defeat did much towards inculcating patience. So the work went on, quietly but surely, the general supported by the President, and the nation giving men and money without remonstrance. The South, on the other hand, was still apathetic. The people, deluded by their decisive victory, underrated the latent strength of their mighty adversary. They appear to have believed that the earthworks which had transformed Centerville into a formidable fortress, manned by the Army of Northern Virginia, as the force under Johnston was now designated, were sufficient in themselves to end the war. They had not yet learned that there were many roads to Richmond, and that a passive defence is no safeguard against a persevering foe. The government, expecting much from the intervention of the European powers, did nothing to press the advantage already gained. In vain, the generals urged the president to reinforce the army at Centerville to 60,000 men, and to give it transport and supplies sufficient to permit the passage of the Potomac above Washington. In vain, they pointed out, in answer to the reply that the government could furnish neither men nor arms, that large bodies of troops were retained at points the occupation of which by the enemy would cause only a local inconvenience. Was it not possible, they asked the president, by stripping other points to the last they would bear, and even risking defeat at all other places, to put the Virginian army in condition for a forward movement? Success, they said, in the neighbourhood of Washington was success everywhere, and it was upon the northeastern frontier that all the available force of the Confederacy should be concentrated. Mr. Davis was immovable. Although Lee, who had been appointed to a command in West Virginia almost immediately after Bull Run, was no longer at hand to advise him, he probably saw the strategical requirements of the situation. That a concentrated attack on a vital point is a better measure of security than dissemination along a frontier, that the counterstroke is the soul of the defence, and that the true policy of the state which is compelled to take up arms against a superior foe is to allow that foe no breathing space, are truisms which it would be an insult to his ability to say that he did not realize. But to have surrendered territory to the temporary occupation of the enemy in order to seek a problematical victory elsewhere would have probably provoked a storm of discontent. The authority of the new government was not yet firmly established, nor was the patriotism of the Southern people so entirely unselfish as to render them willing to endure minor evils in order to achieve a great result. They were willing to fight, but they were unwilling that their own states should be left unprotected. To apply Frederick the Great's maxim requires greater strength of will in the statesman than in the soldier. The cries and complaints of those who find themselves abandoned do not penetrate to the camp, but they may bring down an administration. It is easy to contrive excuses for the inaction of the president, and it is no new thing to find the demands of strategy sacrificed to political expediency. Nor did the army which had suffered so heavily on the banks of Bull Run evince any marked desire to be led across the Potomac. Furloughs were liberally granted. Officers and privates dispersed to look after their farms and their plantations. The harvests had to be gathered, the Negroes required the master's eye, and even the counties of Virginia asked that part of the contingents they had furnished might be permitted to return to agricultural pursuits. The senior generals of the Virginia army were not alone in believing that the victory they had won would be barren of result unless it were at once utilized as a basis for further action. Jackson, engrossed as he was with the training of his command, found time to reflect on the broader aspects of the war. Before he left for the Shenandoah Valley, he sought an interview with General G.W. Smith, recently appointed to the command of his division. "Finding me lying down in my tent," writes this officer, "he expressed regret that I was sick, and said he had come to confer with me on a subject of great importance, but would not then trouble me with it. I told him that I wished to hear whatever he desired to say, and could rest whilst he was talking. He immediately sat down on the ground near the head of the cot on which I was lying, and entered on the subject of his visit. 'McClellan,' he said, 'with his army of recruits, will not attempt to come out against us this autumn. If we remain inactive, they will have greatly the advantage over us next spring. Their raw recruits will have then become an organized army, vastly superior in numbers to our own. We are ready at the present moment for active operations in the field, while they are not. We ought to invade their country now, and not wait for them to make the necessary preparations to invade ours. If the President would reinforce this army by taking troops from other points not threatened and let us make an active campaign of invasion before winter sets in, McClellan's raw recruits could not stand against us in the field. Crossing the upper Potomac, occupying Baltimore, and taking possession of Maryland, we could cut off the communications of Washington, force the federal government to abandon the capital, beat McClellan's army if it came out against us in the open country, destroy industrial establishments wherever we found them, break up the lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines, seize and, if necessary, destroy the manufactories and commerce of Philadelphia and of other large cities in our reach, take and hold the narrow neck of country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, subsist mainly on the country we traverse, and making unrelenting war amidst their homes, force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South in the Union at the bayonet's point. He then requested me to use my influence with Generals Johnston and Beauregard in favor of immediate aggressive operations. I told him that I was sure that an attempt on my part to exert any influence in favor of his proposition would do no good. Not content with my answer, he repeated his arguments, dwelling more at length on the advantages of such strategy to ourselves and its disadvantages to the enemy, and again urged me to use my influence to secure its adoption. I gave him the same reply I had already made. After a few minutes' thought, he abruptly said, "General, you have not expressed any opinion in regard to the views I have laid before you, but I feel assured that you favour them, and I think you ought to do all in your power to have them carried into effect." I then said, "I will tell you a secret." He replied, "Please do not tell me any secret. I would prefer not to hear it." I answered, "I must tell it to you, and I have no hesitation in doing so, because I am certain that it will not be divulged." I then explained to him that these views had already been laid before the government in a conference which had taken place at Fairfax Courthouse in the first days of October between President Davis, Generals Johnston, Beauregard, and myself, and told him the result. When I had finished, he rose from the ground on which he had been seated, shook my hand warmly, and said, "I am sorry, very sorry." Without another word, he went slowly out to his horse, a few feet in front of my tent, mounted very deliberately, and rode sadly away. A few days afterwards, he was ordered to the valley. November 5th. It was under such depressing circumstances that Jackson quitted the army, which, boldly used, might have ensured the existence of the Confederacy. His headquarters were established at Winchester, and in communication with Centreville by road, rail, and telegraph, although 60 miles distant, he was still subordinate to Johnston. The Confederate front extended from Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock to Winchester on the Opequon. Jackson's force, holding the valley of the Shenandoah and the line of the Potomac westward of Point of Rocks, was the extreme outpost on the left, and was connected with the main body by a detachment at Leesburg, on the other side of the Blue Ridge, under his brother-in-law, General D.H. Hill. At Winchester, his wife joined him, and of their first meeting she tells a pretty story. It can readily be imagined with what delight General Jackson's domestic plans for the winter were hailed by me, and without waiting for the promised aid to be sent on escort, I joined some friends who were going to Richmond, where I spent a few days to shop, to secure a passport, and to await an escort to Winchester. The latter was soon found in a kind-hearted, absent-minded old clergyman. We travelled by stage-coach from Strasbourg and were told, before reaching Winchester, that General Jackson was not there, having gone with his command on an expedition. It was therefore with a feeling of sad disappointment and loneliness that I alighted in front of Taylor's Hotel at midnight, in the early part of dreary cold December, and no husband to meet me with a glad welcome. By the dim lamplight I noticed a small group of soldiers standing in the wide hall, but they remained silent spectators, and my escort led me up the big stairway, doubtless feeling disappointed that he still had me on his hands. Just before reaching the landing, I turned to look back, for one figure among the group looked startlingly familiar, but as he had not come forward, I felt that I must be mistaken. However, my backward glance revealed an officer muffled up in a military greatcoat, cap drawn down over his eyes, following us in rapid pursuit, and by the time we were upon the top step, a pair of strong arms caught me. The captive's head was thrown back, and she was kissed again and again by her husband before she could recover from the delightful surprise he had given her. The good old minister chuckled gleefully, and was no doubt a sincere sharer in the joy and relief experienced by his charge. When I asked my husband why he did not come forward when I got out of the coach, he said he wanted to assure himself that it was his own wife, as he didn't want to commit the blunder of kissing anybody else's esposa. The people amongst whom they found themselves were Virginian to the core. In Winchester itself, the feeling against the North was exceptionally bitter. The town was no mushroom settlement. Its history stretched back to the old colonial days. The grass-grown entrenchments on the surrounding hills had been raised by Washington during the Indian Wars, and the traditions of the first struggle for independence were not yet forgotten. No single section of the South was more conservative. Although the citizens had been strong Unionists, nowhere were the principles which their fathers had respected, the sovereignty of the individual state and the right of secession, more strongly held, and nowhere had the hereditary spirit of resistance to coercive legislation blazed up more fiercely. The soldiers of Bull Run, who had driven the invader from the soil of Virginia, were the heroes of the hour, and the leader of the Stonewall Brigade had peculiar claims on the hospitality of the town. It was to the people of the valley that he owed his command. With one voice, wrote the Secretary of War, have they made constant and urgent appeals that to you, in whom they have confidence, their defence should be assigned. The Winchester ladies, says Mrs. Jackson, were amongst the most famous of Virginia housekeepers, and lived in a good deal of old-fashioned elegance and profusion. The old border town had not then changed hands with the conflicting armies, as it was destined to do so many times during the war. Under the rose-coloured light in which I viewed everything that winter, it seemed to me that no people could have been more cultivated, attractive, and noble-hearted. Winchester was rich in happy homes and pleasant people, and the extreme kindness and appreciation shown to General Jackson by all bound us to them so closely and warmly that ever after that winter he called the place our war home. But amid congenial acquaintances and lovely surroundings, with the tumult of war quiescent, and the domestic happiness so dear to him restored, Jackson allowed no relaxation either to himself or to his men. His first care was to train and organize his new regiments. The ranks were filled with recruits, and to their instruction he devoted himself with unwearied energy. His small force of cavalry, commanded by Colonel Turner Ashby, a gentleman of Virginia, whose name was to become famous in the annals of the Confederacy, he at once dispatched to patrol the frontier. Prompt measures were taken to discipline the troops, and that this last was a task of no little difficulty the following incident suggests. In the middle of November, to Jackson's great delight, the Stonewall Brigade had been sent to him from Manassas, and after its arrival an order was issued which forbade all officers leaving the camp except upon passes from headquarters. A protest was immediately drawn up by the regimental commanders and laid before the general. They complained that the obnoxious order was an unwarranted assumption of authority, disparaged their dignity, and detracted from that respect of the force under their command which was necessary to maintain their authority and enforce obedience. Jackson's reply well illustrates his own idea of discipline and of the manner in which it should be upheld. His adjutant general wrote as follows to the discontented officers: "The Major General commanding desires me to say that the within combined protest is in violation of army regulations and subversive of military discipline. He claims the right to give his pickets such instructions as in his opinion the interests of the service require. Colonels, and, on the day that their regiments arrived at their present encampment, either from incompetency to control their commands or from neglect of duty, so permitted their commands to become disorganized, and their officers and men to enter Winchester without permission, as to render several arrests of officers necessary. If officers desire to have control over their commands, they must remain habitually with them, industriously attend to their instruction and comfort, and in battle lead them well, and in such a manner as to command their admiration. Such officers need not apprehend loss of respect resulting from inserting in a written pass the words "on duty" or "on private business," should they have occasion to pass the pickets. Even the Stonewall Brigade had yet much to learn. At this time, Jackson was besieged with numerous applications for service on his staff. The majority of these were from persons without experience, and they were made to the wrong man. "My desire," he wrote, "is to get a staff specially qualified for their specific duties. I know Mr. Taine personally, and was favourably impressed by him. But if a person desires office in these times, the best thing for him to do is to pitch into service somewhere and work with such energy, skill, and success as to impress those round him with the conviction that such are his merits that he must be advanced, or the interests of the service must suffer. My desire is to make merit the basis of my recommendations." Social claims had no weight with him whatever. He felt that the interests at stake were too great to be sacrificed to favouritism or friendship, and he had seen enough of war to know the importance of staff work. Nor was he in the unfortunate position of being compelled to accept the nominees of his superiors. The Confederate authorities were wise enough to permit their generals to choose for themselves the instruments on which they would have to rely for the execution of their designs. Wellington, in 1815, had forced on him by the Horse Guards, in the teeth of his indignant remonstrances, incompetent officers whom he did not know and whom he could not trust. Jackson, in a country which knew little of war, was allowed to please himself. He need appoint no one without learning all about him, and his inquiries were searching. Was he intelligent? Was he trustworthy? Was he industrious? Did he get up early? If a man was wanting in any one of these qualifications, he would reject him, however highly recommended. That his strict investigations and his insistence on the possession of certain essential characteristics bore good fruit it is impossible to gainsay. The absence of mishaps and errors in his often complicated manoeuvres is sufficient proof that he was exceedingly well served by his subordinates. The influence of a good staff is seldom apparent except to the initiated. If a combination succeeds, the general gets all the credit. If it fails, he gets all the blame. And while no agents, however efficient, can compensate by their own efforts for the weakness of a conception that is radically unsound, many a brilliant plan has failed in execution through the inefficiency of the staff. In his selection of such capable men as his assistants must needs have been, Jackson gave proof that he possessed one at least of the attributes of a great leader. He was not only a judge of character, but he could place men in the positions to which they were best suited. His personal predilections were never allowed to interfere. For some months his chief of the staff was a Presbyterian clergyman, while his chief quartermaster was one of the hardest swearers in Virginia. The fact that the former could combine the duties of a spiritual adviser with those of his official position made him a congenial comrade, but it was his energy and ability rather than this unusual qualification which attracted Jackson. And although the profanity of the quartermaster offended his susceptibilities, their relations were always cordial. It was to the intelligence of his staff officers, their energy and their loyalty that he looked. For the business in hand, these qualities were more important than their morals. That a civilian should be found serving as chief of the staff to a general of division, one of the most important posts in the military hierarchy, is a curious comment on the organization of the Confederate Army. The regular officers who had thrown in their lot with the South had, as a rule, been appointed to commands, and the generals of lower rank had to seek their staff officers amongst the volunteers. It may be noticed, however, that Jackson was by no means bigoted in favour of his own cloth. He showed no anxiety to secure their services on his staff. He thought many of them unfitted for duties which brought them in immediate contact with the volunteers. In dealing with such troops, tact and temper are of more importance than where obedience has become mechanical, and the claims of rank are instinctively reflected. In all his campaigns, too, Jackson was practically his own chief of the staff. He consulted no one. He never divulged his plans. He gave his orders, and his staff had only to see that these orders were obeyed. His topographical engineer, his medical director, his commissary, and his quartermaster were selected, it is true, by reason of their special qualifications. Captain Hotchkiss, who filled the first position, was a young man of 26, whose abilities as a surveyor were well known in the valley. Major Harmon, his chief quartermaster, was one of the proprietors of a line of stagecoaches and a large farmer, and Major Hawkes, his commissary, was the owner of a carriage manufactory. But the remainder of his assistants, with the exception of the chief of artillery, owed their appointments rather to their character than to their professional abilities. It is not to be understood, at the same time, that Jackson underrated soldierly acquirements. He left no complaints on record, like so many of his West Point comrades, of the ignorance of the volunteer officers, and of the consequent difficulties which attended every combination. But he was none the less alive to their deficiencies. Early in 1862, when the military system of the Confederacy was about to be reorganized, he urged upon the government, through the member of Congress for the district where he commanded, that regimental promotion should not be obtained by seniority, unless the applicant were approved by a board of examination. And it was due to his representations that this regulation, to the great benefit of the army, was shortly afterwards adopted. With all his appreciation of natural aptitude for the soldier's trade, so close a student of Napoleon could scarcely be blind to the fact that the most heroic character, unsustained by knowledge, is practically useless. If Napoleon himself, more highly endowed by nature with every military attribute than any other general of the Christian era, thought it essential to teach himself his business by incessant study, how much more is such study necessary for ordinary men? But no man was less likely than Jackson to place an exaggerated value on theoretical acquirements. No one realized more fully that Napoleon's character won more victories than Napoleon's knowledge. The qualities he demanded in his subordinates were those which were conspicuous in Napoleon. Who was more industrious than the great Corsican? Who displayed an intenser energy? Whose intelligence was brighter? Who understood human nature better, or handled men with more consummate tact? These were the very attributes which distinguished Jackson himself. They are the keynote to his success, more so than his knowledge of strategy and tactics, of the mechanism of march and battle, and of the principles of the military art. In selecting his staff officers, therefore, he deemed character of more importance than erudition. The men of the Stonewall Brigade had a saying that Jackson always marched at dawn, except when he started the night before, and it was perhaps this habit, which his enemies found so unreasonable, that led him to lay so much stress on early rising. It is certain that, like Wellington, he preferred 3 o'clock in the morning men. In a letter to his wife, he says, "If you will vouch for your brother's being an early riser during the remainder of the war, I will give him an aideship. I do not want to make an appointment on my staff except of such as are early risers, but if you will vouch for him to rise regularly at dawn, I will offer him the position." Another characteristic he looked for was reticence, and it was undeniably of the utmost importance, especially in an army which spoke the same language as the enemy, where desertion was not uncommon, and spies could easily escape detection, that the men who might become cognizant of the plans of the commander should be gifted with discretion. Absolute concealment is generally impracticable in a camp. Maps must be drawn and reports furnished. Reconnoitring parties must be sent out, roads examined, positions surveyed, and shelter and supplies requisitioned in advance. Thus the movements of staff officers are a clue to the projected movements of the army, and the smallest hint may set 100 brains to the work of surmise. There will always be many who are just as anxious to discover the general's intentions as he is to conceal them, and if, by any possibility whatever, the gossip and guesses of the camp may come to the enemy's ears, it is well that curiosity should be balked, nor is it undesirable that the privacy of headquarters should be respected. The vanity of a little brief authority has before now tempted subordinate officers to hint at weaknesses on the part of their superiors. Ignorance of war and of the situation has induced them to criticize and to condemn, and idle words, greedily listened to and quickly exaggerated, may easily destroy the confidence of the soldiery in the abilities of their leader. By the middle of December, Jackson's small army had become fairly effective. Its duties were simple: to watch the enemy, to keep open the communication with Manassas, so as to be ready to join the main army should McClellan advance. Such were Johnston's orders. The upper Potomac was held by the enemy in force. General Banks, a volunteer officer who was yet to learn more of Stonewall Jackson, was in command. The headquarters of his division, 18,000 strong, were at Frederick City in Maryland, but his charge extended 75 miles further west, as far as Cumberland on the Potomac. In addition to Banks, General Kelly with 5,000 men was at Romney, on the south branch of the Potomac, 35 miles northwest of Winchester by a good road. The Federal troops guarding the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and that portion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad which was still intact, were necessarily much dispersed, for the Confederate guerrillas were active, and dam and aqueduct, tunnel and viaduct offered tempting objectives to Ashby's cavalry. Still, the force which confronted Jackson was far superior to his own. The Potomac was broad and bridgeless, and his orders appeared to impose a defensive attitude. But he was not the man to rest inactive, no matter what the odds against him, or to watch the enemy's growing strength without an endeavour to interfere.